So this is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Everyone recognises that in the end there will have to be a negotiated solution to this conflict, but it's for the Ukrainians.
With the Ukrainians declaring, having driven everyone out of their country. Okay, so you're in the room. Would you offer more money than the government is offering?
There's going to have to be compromise. It's not just about pay.
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you. People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things, and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And we may say all your examples.
My name's Andy Bell, and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, we bring context and understanding to a big story in the news by talking to people with real insight. This week, a lot of our politicians seem to be behaving badly at the moment, whether it's tax or allegations of bullying or just playing fast and loose with the rules. What is going on? And is the system we have to keep our politicians in line actually working? I've been talking about all this to the director of the Institute for Government, Dr. Hannah White. So, Hannah White, thanks very much for coming to talk to us. Just looking at the sort of roll call of names, we've had, Gavin Williamson, Nadeem Zahawi, Suella Braverman, Dominic Raab, everybody in some degree of trouble over conduct in public life. Is it me, or have we just got a rather bad batch of this going on at the moment? What's happening?
We do seem to be going through a slightly bad run, don't we? I think partly it's about choices that Rishi Sunak's made about who to have in his cabinet. Partly it's about people who were actually elevated by his predecessors, who he's chosen to retain or bring back into government. So the decisions about making those people ministers were not originally his, but he's made the same decisions. And the question has been what evidence he's had, what reporting there has been to him of their behaviour before he's made those decisions.
So there's quite a few cases going on at the moment. Do you just remind us, first of all, how is the behaviour of ministers kind of regulated or enforced? What's the mechanism?
So every new Prime Minister publishes what's called the Ministerial Code, and it's their version of the set of rules that they want their ministers to follow. And that's owned by that Prime Minister, so they can put whatever spin on it they like. They can change the rules if they want to. And Rishi Sunak did change some of the rules when he came in. He changed the rule about how far you could get a ministerial car to drive you on your way home, possibly because his constituency is a long way away.
Oh, really? So he literally, down to that sort of level, he actually changed it.
So, yeah, it used to be that you had to, it was within a sort of reasonable distance of London, but he extended that. So any new...
To Yorkshire.
Well, there's no limit now. So Prime Ministers can change the rules. And then the normal arrangement is that the Prime Minister appoints an ethics advisor, the advisor on ministerial standards, who is an independent person to whom they can delegate the task of investigating any alleged breaches of the ministerial code. Now, again, the work of that advisor is very much in the Prime Minister's hands. The Prime Minister has to agree for them to undertake any investigation. They can't be done independently by that advisor. And the Prime Minister also gets to control what of their findings is published, although the undertaking is it should be done in a reasonable time. And then once the findings of any investigation are published, the Prime Minister gets to determine whether and what any sanction would be if a minister was found to have breached the code.
I mean, there are a couple of things there. Famously, we didn't have one of these for about 6 months. I mean, she wasn't there for very long, but Liz Truss didn't have one at all. And some people started saying, well, do we need this? Because in the end, it is actually up to the Prime Minister to make all these decisions. What do you think?
Well, and Boris Johnson, of course, famously managed to lose two advisors who resigned under his watch. I mean, at the Institute for Government, we think it's very useful to have this sort of independent person to whom a Prime Minister can delegate this investigatory process. It means that they can say, I'm taking this seriously. I've asked someone to find out the facts, and I want to know the facts in order to make my decision. If they don't do that, there's always a question over, who is conducting the inquiry, how might they be being influenced by the Prime Minister. If it's done by the civil service, sometimes that can put the civil service in a difficult position, as we saw with the Sue Gray inquiry into Boris Johnson. And if you have to keep appointing different KCs, because you haven't got someone in that role, then you don't necessarily get the sort of consistency of approach that is desirable when thinking about ministerial standards.
Now, I seem to remember that at one stage, Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, Lord Geit at the time was trying to insist that he should have the right to initiate investigations without the Prime Minister saying, OK, you're going to look into this. Sounds like Lord Geit lost that battle. Is that right?
He did. I mean, a number of the advisors recently have made that argument, and no Prime Minister has wanted to give up control over whether an investigation should happen. Again, we think that should be part of the independence of the advisor. Should be to choose to conduct an investigation when they want to. We different sort of ethics advisors in our system have different powers. So the Commissioner for Public Appointments, who came into public view recently because of the controversy over Richard Sharp, the BBC chairman, and his appointment when he'd potentially, it's alleged, given advice to Boris Johnson on his financial affairs. That advisor, William Shawcross, can choose to launch his own investigations. And he did that before remembering that he knew Richard Sharp quite well and recusing himself and suggesting that somebody else should do it. But, so it's not unreasonable to think that the advisor should have that power.
I mean, do you have a situation where, under our system, the Prime Minister gets to appoint an ethics advisor in the first place, maybe doesn't have to, as we know, we had a long period recently where there wasn't one, also decides whether there should be an investigation at all into any matter, and in the end decides what should happen as a result of the investigation. In the end, it is still basically the Prime Minister who decides. Is that the right way for the system to be working now?
Well, this was really thrown into relief when it was the Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson, who was accused of having breached the ministerial code, and then the sort of illogicality of him being sort of judge and jury on himself was really thrown up. In normal circumstances, this all rests on the principle that the Prime Minister should get to determine who is in their cabinet from amongst the people who are elected to the House of Commons, and that decision democratically should be for them.
Even when it's a question of rules being broken and conduct, as opposed to political decisions.
Well, again, they are the Prime Minister's rules to set. And we saw, for example, the reason Boris Johnson's first advisor resigned was because the advisor thought the rules had been broken by Priti Patel. He thought that she had bullied civil servants, but Boris Johnson took the view that he didn't agree with that. And so in the end, that responsibility rests with the Prime Minister, and you move away at that point from the rules into a political judgment, and the Prime Minister saying, well, I am prepared politically to say that I don't think this, I deem this to be a breach or a serious breach because I want to keep this person in my cabinet.
And do you think that system is good enough now, or does it need to be strengthened?
I think the system needs to be strengthened. I think the spectacle of Prime Ministers not quite getting round to having an advisor is problematic. I think that we ought to put the advisor on a statutory basis, so a requirement to have one should be there in law. I think they should have their own ability to launch investigations and to publish their findings, and then it should be for the Prime Minister to determine what they want to make of them. But that would really do a lot, I think, to bolster public confidence in politics, to feel that there was someone independent there who could take that step.
And what about MPs taking a step down from ministerial level? Are the rules in place strong enough there? Because certainly when it comes to MPs and staff, for instance, there's some very difficult areas because of the way staff are employed by MPs. What do you think?
So there is a whole separate system for MPs, which also applies to ministers. So Parliament has an MP's Code of Conduct, which is overseen by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, who is an independent parliamentary official. She or he can launch their own investigations or have complaints made to them and undertake investigations. And that would all be to see if the MP's Code of Conduct had been broken. In recent years, exactly as you say, the fact that MPs effectively they employ their own staff. But then there are also staff of the House of Commons, and then there are a whole set of people who come in and out of Parliament, who work in Parliament, who MPs interact with. And it's been highlighted that actually the way in which MPs behave towards all those sets of people wasn't necessarily covered very well by the ministerial code. So following some bullying scandals, there was a sort of a new part of the system was introduced to be able to look specifically at bullying and harassment cases. And that's a system which has a lot more independence built into it, because it was recognised that MPs find it really hard for legitimate reasons to be objective about their peers when they have relationships with them, when their friends, their colleagues, their party colleagues, and it's difficult for them to play that role.
So there is now an independent, more formalised system that should be there to protect, say, staff of MPs now.
So any sort of allegation of bullying or harassment that occurs on the parliamentary estate can be investigated under this new independent complaints and grievance scheme. There's an independent investigation. If it's a relatively sort of minor infringement, that can be resolved by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. If it's more serious, it gets escalated to what's called the Independent Expert Panel, which, like it sounds, is stocked with sort of lawyers, HR specialists, and so on, and they take a view on the evidence and the seriousness of it. They recommend a sanction which could be suspension or, in the worst case, expulsion from the House of Commons. But the final point in the process for something like that does have to be signed off by the House of Commons. So that's would have
the
to go.
Standards Committee, isn't it? Yeah.
That's not the Standards Committee. So the IEP verdict goes straight to the House for a vote. But on the non-bullying side, it goes via the Standards Committee.
Right. Okay. Bullying. We seem to be talking quite a lot about it. Are you surprised, with your knowledge of the way government and politics works, that we seem to have a bullying problem? Can I put it like that in public life?
Well, based on my experience of working in and around Westminster, the allegations that have come out recently don't surprise me at all. I think we probably shouldn't be surprised that maybe the prevalence of bullying and harassment that occurs sort of in and around politics is maybe higher than in the rest of the population, for a couple of reasons. One, that I think that there is probably, a self-selecting set of people who choose to go into politics who, maybe are, a bit more thick-skinned, a bit more prepared to be robust, a bit more sort of driven. So they might be, in some circumstances, more likely to manifest these sorts of behaviours. But I also think when you get into the sort of political environment, it doesn't help people behave well. There is a really significant power dynamic between people who are elected in Westminster and everyone else who is an unelected official or person working with them. People who are MPs are sort of given a status, which some of them then sort of makes them feel that they can throw that power around. And it's also very pressurised. There are lots of pressures, time pressures, political pressures on people. And I think sort of behaving well in those circumstances is probably harder. Now, I don't think that's an excuse. I don't think that, I think it's a great privilege to be a member of Parliament, and we should expect the very highest standards of behaviour from those people. But I'm saying this as a sort of explanation of maybe why it happens. I've
certainly had conversations with a couple of MPs who sort of roll their eyes a bit at the sort of thing you've just been saying, and they say, well, look, nobody is forced to come into this world, and it's a tough old game, and let's get on with it. And it's only in the last few years that people have started to see it in this way. Do you think there's any justification for that kind of talk?
I think it's only in the last few years that people who are, at the wrong end of this power dynamic have had the means to report what has been happening to them with any degree of confidence that anything might happen. So when you think that you are the powerless person, and even if you complain, nothing will happen, then you don't complain. That doesn't make you kind of, that doesn't mean that's a laudable situation. That means that's a situation in which a set of people are disempowered and other people get to throw their weight around. And I think that just because something is now understood to be unacceptable doesn't mean that's a sort of snowflakery. We have... misogyny used to be seen as perfectly acceptable, but it caused all sorts of harms, which meant that women suffered in society. Now we don't think that is acceptable, and I think it's the same with bullying.
And do you think that then we have had progress in that field in the last few years.
Yeah, I would say it is progress. I mean, in some ways, you asked me at the start about whether things have got worse, and I think in some ways it seems worse at the moment because more of this behaviour is being reported because people believe there could be consequences. We're maybe going through a bit of a sort of hump in terms of historic cases of bullying coming to the fore, people who, now believe that a minister who, they felt bullied by in the past, that something might happen if they report that now. Maybe that's why they're coming out of the woodwork, not because, there's a sort of a woke conspiracy against ministers, but because there's actually a sense that, well, maybe people are taking this seriously now.
I mean, talking about sort of changing of attitudes and changing of situations, I mean, it's probably worth reminding ourselves that when we get stories in the news and go, oh my goodness, and you think, oh, how is that? Sometimes compared to what was going on 20, 30 years ago, it's some of the things that went on then were pretty extraordinary. I mean, some of the attitudes towards, I mean, Winston Churchill, it was longer than 30 years ago, but, people just gave him money, basically, just bankrolled him because he was, leading the country. I mean, the sort of thing that would today be considered just unacceptable. I
think that's right, and society changes and norms do change. But, there are standards of behaviour which I think are expected now in any workplace. And we shouldn't treat Westminster as an exception and say just because these people have power, they should get to exert that power in ways that harms other people.
How do we do in the sort of international comparison, if I can put it that way, in terms of both the public the behaviour of our major public servants and also the sort of systems in place to deal with it?
Well, like I say, I think that it is inevitable that there is bad behaviour around politics because politics is to do with power, and it's to do with power dynamics between politicians and the people they work with, but also between politicians and the rest of society. MPs and ministers are making big decisions involving large amounts of public money, and the fact that that there may be temptations associated with that, or people trying to influence them in inappropriate ways, means that there is an inevitable risk around politics. So that is the same in other countries, and in other countries, there are in some ways, you see scandals involving much larger sums of money, where maybe there aren't the same controls around sort of planning systems and things that we have in this country. I think in general, our system of politics is pretty well regulated. For example, there are much greater controls over the amount of money that can be spent around elections than there are, say, for example, in the US. And that sort of thing means that, maybe there's less risk of inappropriate influence over our politics.
Yeah, I mean, extraordinarily small amounts of money in some ways compared to certainly compared to what can be spent in the US. I mean, the amount that can be spent per constituency and that kind of thing. Have we got less a problem with money and more a problem with behaviour? Is that possible to say? Well,
the way in which our ethics regulation has evolved has been always to deal with the last problem. So we sort of got an ethics system in the first place in the 1990s after cash for questions and lots of scandals involving money. And so that's why the MP's Code of Conduct is very focused around declarations of financial interest and making sure that all MPs' financial systems are in order. Next, we had the MP's expenses scandal. In response to that, we set up a whole new body to administer MP's expenses to make sure that couldn't happen. And then most recently, we've had a bullying scandal, which has meant we've realised the inadequacy of systems in Parliament, and we've dealt with that. So I think it's a sort of iterative process. We've perceived problems and we've dealt with them. The disadvantage of that is that the ethical system is quite sort of bitty, and people often argue, politicians often argue that they didn't follow the rules because the rules were too complicated and they didn't understand how they applied. And there are other countries, say for example Canada, who've tried to take a much more overarching sort of look at ethics and have sort of an overarching body who is responsible, and there have been calls for that here, but inevitably, it's much easier to sort of just make a sort of one incremental change in response to a scandal than to reconceive the whole system once you've built all sorts of vested interest into it and people who think they've got jobs to do they don't want to give up doing.
I mean, in terms of, if I can put it like this, good old-fashioned corruption, for instance, and just graft from politicians, how do we compare to some continental countries, for instance, or anywhere else? Is it possible to say?
Well, you have, in Italy, for example, you have politicians who are paid a lot more than our politicians, and you have scandals involving much larger sums of money than we tend to see here. I mean, that's not to say, and I don't think, any of us know for sure what the extent of corruption may be in our planning system here. We have systems. I think, we should feel good about the fact that, we've recognised the risks that there are around politics, and we've done our best in various ways to make to mitigate those risks. And we saw, I think, interestingly, in relation to the coronavirus pandemic, what can happen when actually some of those systems are taken away, when government says, we've got to procure a whole lot of PPE really quickly. We're going to remove some of our systems because the priority is to get the PPE to the people on the front line. And then subsequently, there's a lot of outrage about the fact that there was some corruption in that system, and that there were some, contracts given that people retrospectively feel that shouldn't have been given. But that was a risk-based choice that, the government knew when they took some of those controls that had been put in place around procurement away, that was a risk, but they judged that a risk worth taking.
Just in terms of that, do you think that MPs and ministers should be paid more in the UK?
This is an unpopular view, but I actually think they should be paid a bit more. I think that the last time that the sort of system for setting MPs' pay, which now goes up according to is linked to an index.
I mean, it's around about, we should say it's around about, 85,000?
Yes, it's around about 85,000. So it was the sort of baseline was set in the aftermath of the expenses scandal, which I think artificially meant it was depressed a bit below what it should be. And then it was linked to an index, so it uprates according to that index. But the trouble is, there is no right answer to how much to pay MPs.
But you think it should be a bit more?
I think it should be a bit more. Because
ministers too? Because ministers are on about 125 or so, I think.
Yeah, I think everybody could be paid a bit more in the system. I think it would remove some of the incentive on people to feel that they need to have second jobs, because I think that being an MP is an practically undoable job. There is so much to do. If you layer on top of that a ministerial role, it becomes, absolutely all-consuming. And so the idea that you would also have time to do a second job, I think, is problematic. And so I think it would remove that. It would attract more people into politics and just make MPs' lives a bit easier. I mean, to be honest, running two... they get various sort of expenses and so on, but trying to run two households in different parts of the country is an expensive business. And lots of MPs are so scared that they're going to get pilloried in the press for even claiming the expenses which they are entitled to claim, that they don't do it because they're so worried that they're going to get that negative publicity.
Yeah, and some of them like to say, look how little I've claimed, and make that part of their appeal when it comes to election time. I mean, you could ban second jobs for MPs. Do you think that you should do that?
I mean, my view is that you should limit the amount of time that they can spend. So it's difficult to limit the amount of money, but I think you should say that Parliament should take a political view on how much time they think it's reasonable for people to be spending on other interests, and get MPs to record how much time they are spending on those things. This is a possibility that I think MPs have dodged. They think it feels too much like sort of an onerous responsibility for MPs to have to fill in those timesheets. But I think if they've got time to do the second jobs, they should have time to record the time spent on them. And I think that I don't buy the arguments around what these second jobs bring to Parliament, because if you want the interests of lawyers and journalists really well represented in our legislature, then by all means let them have second jobs. But it doesn't, there are very few MPs who are working on the front line in the NHS. There are one or two, or who are, refuse collectors, or who are also teachers. It's a very the argument that you need second jobs in order to bring that lived experience into the House, I think, just doesn't really stack up.
Okay, and final question on this. 150,000, too little for the Prime Minister? Should get more?
Well, I mean, I don't see how the Prime Minister ever has time to spend any money, given how much time they have. It's a political choice. The interesting thing when you ask members of the public about what to pay politicians is they all start from where they are. So the people who are paid £25,000 think that's what MPs ought to get. The people who are on £50,000 think that's what they ought to get. And the people who are on £200,000 think that's what they ought to get. There is no comparable job that you can actually compare it to in terms of the responsibility that they have for legislating and for scrutinising government. And if you look internationally, there's a very wide range of practice. There is no right answer. It has to be a political question, but I think there would be some advantages to paying them a bit more.
Okay. Sort of a bigger thought on all this, maybe underpinning the whole thing. It's often said that we have a system that kind of relies on the good chap theory of government and public service, that basically you rely on people doing the right thing. Do you think that is the case still, or has that changed? And if it is the case, are the good chaps still there? And obviously the good ladies as well.
So I think that has been the system. We have had a system which relies a lot on people exercising their judgment and acting according to principle, rather than having detailed rules on everything. But in recent years, we've seen ministers who are saying to civil servants, well, where does it tell me I can't do this? And if it's not written down that I can't do it, then I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I think it's a bit paradoxical because ministers have both taken that attitude, but also the government has, in lots of circumstances, railed against the courts and the lawyers and the people trying to prevent them doing things. But the attitude that ministers have taken towards the rules is sort of pushing us in a direction, lots of sort of people in the outside world of saying, well, perhaps we need to write more of this down. And certainly at the Institute, we think some of the ethics system does need more of a legal basis so that it isn't optional, because prime ministers have shown that they think that having an ethics advisor, for example, might be optional, and we don't think those things should be optional. But if you don't like having judges and lawyers telling you what to do, then you have to demonstrate the judgment and be a good chap and understand the kind of the principle behind a rule and think about that, rather than just saying, oh well, if it doesn't specifically tell me I can't do it, then I'm not going to comply.
Sounds like you think we've been pushing this to the limit now, and that maybe something needs to be tightened up even further. Yeah,
I think there is a case for more things being written down, and I think that that would be good from the public's point of view. They would be able to have more confidence, but it would also be good from politicians' point of view. They do, with reasonable frequency and more or less plausibility, tell us that the rules are complex, or they fell inadvertently between two sets of rules. Well, then maybe we need to make sure that those rules are tightened up so it's absolutely clear.
Then you're relying on the politicians to tighten up the rules that govern their own behaviour. Is that likely?
Well, unfortunately, we only seem to sort of tighten rules and set up new systems after a scandal. But we need to make sure we take the opportunities of things going wrong or fresh starts. I think the Rishi Sunak has a rapidly evaporating window in which he could be saying, I want to lead a government of integrity and accountability, which he has said, but showing us what that means in terms of the decisions he makes around cases involving his ministers, and reflecting on whether the rules are clear and are doing what he wants. He's got an opportunity to do that as a new prime minister, and future people coming into power. The Labour Party, I would anticipate, may put in their manifesto things to do with ethics, because ethics scandals have been such a feature of the latter years of this 12-year stretch we've had so far of Conservative government, that I think that Labour may see it as a way to differentiate themselves if they put it in their manifesto, and if they did, as the polls suggest, win the next election, then that might lead to change because they had committed to it in advance.
We shall see. Hannah White from the Institute for Government, thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Dr. Hannah White from the Institute for Government, calling time on the good chaps theory of public standards. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and please share, rate and review. This is a Channel 5 podcast produced by Silvia Maresca. Thank you for listening to this episode of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.